April 12, 1945, 2:47 a.m. Kakazu Ridge, Okinawa. In the darkness, a Japanese officer sat writing by the light of a bamboo pen scratching across rice paper. His hands shook as he recorded one of the only known accounts of encountering a new American weapon. What he described broke apart 30 years of Japanese military belief. The Americans had machines that allowed them to see in total darkness. This was no rumor. They were cutting down infiltrators at 70 yards in black night. No flashes came from their guns. No light gave away their positions. The Japanese were blind, but the Americans were not. That night on Kakazu Ridge, the Japanese came face to face with something their army had never prepared for. For 3 years, Japan had ruled the night. From the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 through the Pacific campaigns, their soldiers had perfected night fighting. At Guadalcanal in Burma, and across countless battles, Japanese night attacks terrified Allied troops. But here in Okinawa, American soldiers struck them down in pitch darkness with accuracy that seemed impossible. The attack force from the 62nd Division's Night Assault Unit was wiped out. Soldiers were killed by clean, precise fire from enemies they could not see. There were no star shells, no flares, no searchlights, only invisible gunfire that found its mark every time. Japan's greatest advantage had suddenly turned into a deadly weakness. What the Japanese officer didn't know was that his men had just been hit by the M3 Carbine, later renamed the M3. This was not an ordinary rifle. It carried the new Sniperscope, an infrared night vision system that allowed American soldiers to see clearly from 70 to 125 yards in complete darkness. The secret was so closely guarded that most American troops had no idea it existed. But for the Japanese, its appearance was devastating. An army built on the idea that darkness leveled the battlefield was now being destroyed by a weapon that reversed that rule. Japan's faith in night fighting ran deep. Since the Meiji Restoration, their commanders had emphasized it as a way to offset Western firepower. At Port Arthur in 1904, Japanese night attacks had broken Russian positions thought impossible to crack. Through decades of war in China, they refined the tactic. In 1944, American intelligence even captured and translated Japan's official night combat manual. In it, the Japanese army declared, "Night removes all technical superiority. In darkness, spirit and training overcome machines. One Japanese soldier at night equals 10 who depend on technology." This was not empty propaganda. At Guadalcanal in 1942, Japanese night assaults nearly destroyed the U.S. Marine positions. During the battles of Edson's Ridge and Henderson, field Marines admitted privately they had only barely survived. Colonel Merritt Edson wrote in his own report, "They came at night like ghosts. Our men fired at sounds, at shadows, at fear itself. The Japanese moved as if born to the night." Studies by the U.S. Army's Operations Research Office backed this up. From 1942 to 1944, 60% of American casualties in the Pacific came during night fighting, even though night battles made up only 30% of the time in combat. Japanese infiltration units killed at higher rates at night than they ever did in daylight. The numbers proved it. The darkness belonged to Japan. Japanese soldiers trained for this role with relentless discipline. For months they practiced blindfolded, taking apart and putting together weapons by touch alone. They learned to march, without sound, to signal with taps and hand movements to recognize the noises of American weapons in the dark. They could identify the click of an M1 Garand or the cycle of a bar at 50 yards just by listening. By every standard, they were masters of the night. But American science was about to overturn all of that. The infrared Sniperscope project began. In 1943, when the National Defense Research Committee saw the need for night vision, RCA, the Radio Corporation of America, had been working on image tubes since the 1930s. By 1943, they had created the 1P25 tube, which could turn invisible infrared light into a visible image. The weapon was built from several parts. A special, infrared lamp mounted above the carbine barrel shined light that human eyes could not see. A scope with the 1P25 tube picked up that light and turned it into a green-tinted picture. A heavy battery pack, weighing many pounds, powered the system and was strapped to the soldier's back. In total, the setup weighed 28 to 30 pounds. Heavy, yes, but priceless. It gave the ability to see and fire in total darkness. The T3 carbine, later standardized as the M3, was a modified M2 fitted with this system. Tests at Aberdeen Proving Ground proved its power. Soldiers hit 80% of man-sized targets at 70 yards in complete darkness. In the best conditions, they reached 125 yards. No other weapon in the world could do this. By late 1944, limited production had begun. RCA produced around 1,700 scopes during the war, but only about 150 complete T3 M3 systems made it to the Pacific by spring 1945. Each was issued under strict security. Chosen marksmen received training but were forbidden to talk about the weapon even with fellow U.S. soldiers. The Battle of Okinawa, starting April 1, 1945, became the true test of night vision in combat. U.S. divisions in the invasion, especially the 96th Infantry Division and the 7th Infantry Division, received the first T3 carbines. Each rifle company that expected night infiltration got only 2 of them. Even in such small numbers, they were deadly. The U.S. Army's official history, Okinawa, the last battle, recorded the effect. The 96th Division wrote in its report, "Enemy night infiltration, once our greatest danger, has been neutralized by new equipment that lets us fight in darkness." On the nights of April 1st and April 2nd, Japanese infiltration units launched their traditional night attacks. For years, these tactics had been devastating, but this time the results were reversed. American soldiers with infrared scopes calmly watched Japanese troops moving in what they thought was safe darkness and cut them down before they reached U.S. lines. The 7th Infantry Division described the psychological shock in detail. For the Japanese, the battlefield they once owned had vanished. The night, once their greatest ally, had turned against them. Enemy troops fell into confusion and disorder once they came under precise American fire in total darkness. Their long-practiced infiltration tactics were quickly abandoned after suffering the first heavy losses. The new infrared system worked on a simple but groundbreaking principle. A sealed beam spotlight with an infrared filter projected a cone of invisible light up to 150 yards. This light bounced off objects, and the scope's image intensifier tube collected it. The RCA-built 1P25 tube amplified the invisible light and turned it into visible wavelengths, producing a clear green-tinted view of the battlefield. Technical. Sergeant John Murray of the 96th Infantry Division, one of the earliest trained Sniperscope operators, described the experience in a 1985 interview with the U.S. Army's Center of Military History. He recalled, "Looking through that scope at night was like nothing else I had ever seen. The Japanese showed up as bright green shapes against darker backgrounds. You could make out their faces, see rank markings, even identify their weapons. They moved with skill, using disciplined light infantry tactics, but they had no idea we could see them. The psychological shock was just as powerful as the technology itself." Murray explained further, "For 3 years, the Japanese owned the night. They moved with total confidence in darkness. Watching them through the scope, you could see that confidence in the way they walked. Then we fired, and you could see the panic. They couldn't understand how we were able to target them. Because the infrared beam was invisible to the human eye, Japanese soldiers never realized it was there. Operators were trained to fire single shots or short bursts, then quickly change positions. This made it almost impossible for Japanese forces to return fire, even if they guessed the general direction. Within the first week of the Okinawa invasion, Japanese night activity dropped sharply. The 32nd Army, commanded by General Mitsuru Ushijima, had planned major night counterattacks as part of their overall defense. Those plans collapsed after the initial week's high casualties. Colonel Hiramichi Yahara, the 32nd Army's senior operations officer and one of the few survivors of the battle, wrote in his 1973 memoir, The Battle for Okinawa, "Our night assault units, which had never failed in 3 years of war, were destroyed before they even reached American lines. The Americans possessed some unknown capability." Yahara never learned exactly what that capability was. but his own record described the complete collapse of Japanese night fighting. Elite infiltration units, which had been trained for decades, began refusing to leave their caves after dark. The U.S. Army's Operations Research Office later calculated that in the first week on Okinawa, infrared-equipped troops caused nearly 30% of all Japanese small arms casualties during night combat, even though the devices made up less than 1% of American weapons. Declassified technical reports from 1945 showed both the strengths and weaknesses of the infrared scope system. It worked well in darkness, but it had major limitations that Japanese forces never discovered or used against it. The power supply relied on heavy lead-acid batteries, similar to car batteries. They allowed only 20 to 30 minutes of continuous use, though switching the system on and off could stretch that to a few hours. The entire setup weighed close to 30 pounds, making quick movement impossible. Operators were essentially fixed-position specialists. Weather reduced its effectiveness. In heavy rain, the range dropped to less than 40 yards. Fog and smoke scattered the infrared light, creating bright halos that hid targets. White phosphorus, often used in battle, could make the system useless for a time. In theory, the spotlight could be seen through certain optical devices. Some Japanese naval binoculars with coated lenses were actually able to detect infrared beams, but Japanese troops never realized this and never built any countermeasures. As the Okinawa campaign continued, American forces improved their tactics with the Sniperscope. The 7th Infantry Division developed infrared ambushes. They positioned operators along infiltration routes, water sources, trails, and wire gaps. These teams stayed silent and unseen until Japanese troops entered the kill zone, then destroyed them with deadly accuracy. Reports from the 96th Infantry Division described interlocking fields of observation, with operators covering overlapping sectors to protect the entire defensive line. Targets of opportunity were taken out by rifle fire, while larger groups were marked for artillery or mortar strikes. Some units used the scopes for psychological warfare. They sometimes allowed infiltration parties to pass through untouched, while wiping out others entirely. This unpredictability terrified Japanese troops, who no longer knew if they were being watched. The devices were few in number, about 150 in the entire Okinawa operation, so commanders carefully assigned them to the most vulnerable areas: supply lines, water points, command posts, and weak points in the front. Ironically, their scarcity made them more effective by spreading fear that they might be anywhere. Captured Japanese intelligence reports, translated by the Allied Translator and Interpreter Section (ATIS), show how confused they were. A document from the 62nd Division dated April 20, 1945, guessed that the Americans might have infrared detectors similar to those used in aerial photography. It even suggested rain might reduce their usefulness, a conclusion surprisingly close to the truth. But since they did not understand the spotlight component, they had no way to develop working countermeasures. Other theories were less accurate. One Japanese report claimed that Americans were using drugs to improve eyesight at night, which led to experiments with massive vitamin A doses among Japanese soldiers. Some units even covered themselves with mud, believing the Americans were detecting body heat. They were convinced thermal imaging was involved, which was completely wrong. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, Japanese night warfare, once their strongest advantage, was effectively broken by fewer than 150 infrared-equipped carbines. The most accurate Japanese observation came from the notebook of a captured technical officer. It read, "Americans use artificial light invisible to the human eye. Detection method unknown. Counter-detection impossible with current equipment." But this understanding came too late, and it was never widely shared within their ranks. The true impact of the infrared Sniperscope on Okinawa is shown in multiple military reports. Roughly 150 T3 M3 Carbines were deployed. Within the first week, about 30% of Japanese night combat casualties were caused by infrared-equipped units. Japanese night operations dropped by 94% between April 1st and June 1st, 1945. Engagement ranges, which for normal unaided vision had been only 10 to 15 yards, suddenly stretched to more than 70 yards. The 96th Infantry Division reported that sectors with infrared coverage suffered 78% fewer successful infiltrations compared to areas without it. The psychological effect was even greater than the numbers. Japanese units began avoiding night operations even in places where no infrared rifles were present. The 10th Army's G2 intelligence section noted in its summary, "Enemy has largely abandoned night infiltration tactics. Prisoners report fear of American ability to see in darkness. This capability, whether real or perceived in any given sector, has neutralized a primary enemy tactical advantage." The collapse of Japanese night combat strategy had major consequences. The 32nd Army had relied heavily on night movement for resupply, evacuation of wounded, and reconnaissance. Once the night was no longer safe, frontline positions became cut off. Supplies could not reach forward caves and bunkers. Wounded soldiers could not be removed. Communication between units, often carried by runners in the dark, broke down completely. General Mitsuru Ushijima's carefully planned defense in depth turned into isolated strongpoints that could be destroyed one by one. The U.S. Army's official history later recorded that Japan's inability to function at night, whether due to real infrared surveillance or simple fear of it, greatly accelerated the battle. Strongholds that should have lasted for weeks fell within days. Declassified training materials for infrared operators, released in the 1990s, show how much effort the U.S. invested in preparation. Each operator completed 40 hours of specialized instruction. Training included the theory of infrared light and image intensification, equipment care and repair, target recognition, judging distance through green-tinted images, battery handling and tactical positioning. Security procedures were strict. Manual TM 59341 for the infrared Sniperscope set M2 ordered that equipment must be destroyed if capture was imminent. Every scope was issued with thermite grenades for that purpose. This secrecy reflected how valuable the weapon was. Operators were chosen from expert marksmen, who showed emotional stability and independence. The mental strain of shooting enemies who could not see them was recognized early. Training emphasized that by eliminating infiltrators, operators were saving American lives, not simply killing blind opponents. The U.S. was not the only country developing this technology. German engineers created their own system, the ZG-1229 Vampire, for the STG-44 assault rifle. But it was only fielded in very small numbers during the last months of the war, mainly with Panzer Grenadier units at the Battle of the Bulge and the Rhine crossings. The American advantage lay not just in invention, but in deploying the system in meaningful numbers in the Pacific, training operators, and maintaining strict security. Despite Japan's advanced optical industry, with companies such as Nippon Kogaku, later known as Nikon, they never developed infrared devices for infantry use. This gap reflected a broader theme of the Pacific War. Japanese forces often showed superior training and tactics in certain areas, such as night combat, but American technology and industrial strength erased those advantages. The infrared Sniperscope became the perfect case of a technological solution to a tactical problem. While some Japanese testimonies about night vision remain unverified or are composite accounts, American combat reports confirm its effectiveness. The 7th Infantry Division's regimental journals from April 1945 mention several successful night engagements at ranges that would have been impossible before. One confirmed report from the 96th Infantry Division, dated April 15, 1945, described the following. Sniperscope operator engaged enemy patrol of approximately 12 individuals at 2330 hours. Range approximately 75 yards. 8 enemy killed. Remainder fled. No friendly casualties. Enemy showed no awareness of observation before engagement commenced. Another report from the 7th Infantry Division, dated April 28, 1945, noted, infrared-equipped position, engaged enemy supply party on Trail 3 at 0230, 6 enemy killed. Supplies destroyed by mortar fire directed by Sniperscope operator. Enemy has not attempted to use this trail since. Unable to move on the surface at night, Japanese troops were forced deeper into Okinawa's cave networks. These tunnels, both natural and man-made, had been built as defensive shelters. Now they became the only safe refuge from American night vision. Colonel Hiramichi Yahara described this shift in his memoir. Our forces were reduced to remaining in caves during darkness. Surface movement was authorized only during daylight under concealment. This reversal of our traditional tactics was devastating to morale. But life in the caves created its own problems. The tunnel systems were not fully connected, so units became isolated, unable to coordinate or resupply. The once cohesive layered defense of Okinawa collapsed into scattered pockets of resistance. Overcrowding and lack of sanitation allowed disease to spread quickly in the underground shelters. By the end of the campaign, Japan's mastery of night combat had been broken. A strategy refined over decades had been neutralized in weeks by fewer than 150 infrared rifles. Supplies could no longer reach the front lines. Units began to break apart, and the defensive system that was meant to protect Japanese troops ended up working against them, trapping them instead. While infrared sniperscopes were not directly responsible for all of these losses, they forced Japanese forces into tactical changes that created these disastrous conditions. The battle for Shuri Castle in late May 1945 showed how completely night combat had changed. Shuri Castle, which had become General Ushijima's command center, was defended with detailed counterattack plans built around nighttime operations. These plans were abandoned once it became clear the Americans could fight in total darkness. The history of the 1st Marine Division recorded that the expected Japanese night counterattacks during the Shuri battle never came. Instead, Japanese troops limited their actions to daylight, dawn, or dusk. Entire defensive lines were left at night without resistance. Captured soldiers admitted they feared America's ability to see in the dark. By June 1945, as the Okinawa campaign neared its final stage, Japanese commanders had fully abandoned their traditional night tactics. On June 18, 1945, General Ushijima issued his last order, stating that night surface operations were banned except for desperate final stands where survival was not expected. Statistics across the campaign showed how decisive infrared had been. In areas covered by infrared, American night casualties dropped by 78% compared to earlier Pacific battles. Meanwhile, Japanese night operations, their greatest advantage since 1942, were effectively erased. After Japan's surrender, American intelligence teams investigated how Japanese forces had responded to infrared technology. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey interviewed Japanese officers and found that while some suspected America had some sort of night vision, none understood how it actually worked. In 1946, the Far East Command published its Japanese night combat study, which concluded that the introduction of infrared viewing devices on Okinawa had effectively shut down Japanese night fighting. A tactical doctrine that had taken over 40 years to refine was broken in a matter of weeks. Former Japanese officers later admitted that losing the ability to fight at night was one of the most demoralizing blows of the Okinawa battle. They could accept being outgunned or outproduced, but losing their edge in darkness, where their training had always made the difference, undermined their very identity as soldiers. The success of the infrared sniperscope in 1945 carried forward into the Korean War. By 1950, improved models with longer range and stronger batteries became standard gear. The M3 Carbine fitted with an infrared scope was widely used to protect defensive positions from infiltration at night. Early in the war, Chinese and North Korean troops, many of them advised by Japanese veterans of Okinawa, avoided night combat against Americans, convinced all U.S. units had night vision. This belief gave U.S. forces an advantage in the opening stages. Only later, once they realized most American troops lacked the technology, did Communist forces resume large-scale night attacks. Still, the fear persisted. Whenever unexplained losses occurred at night, they blamed infrared weapons. The early infrared devices used in 1945 relied on active systems that required an infrared spotlight. Over time, technology advanced into passive systems that worked by amplifying natural light. By the Vietnam War, starlight scopes operated on moonlight or starlight alone, removing the need for any spotlight that might give away a position. Today, night vision has moved far beyond those beginnings, with modern thermal imaging and advanced image intensification, able to detect human targets more than a mile away, in any weather, without active illumination. The gap that first appeared on Okinawa has only grown larger, yet the core lesson remains the same. The side that controls the night controls the battlefield. The Japanese soldiers of 1945 were the first to discover this in the harshest way possible. But the story was not only tactical, it was also deeply human. American operators of the Sniperscopes carried a heavy emotional weight. Many felt they were acting more like executioners than soldiers, killing men who never had a chance to see them. Post-war studies found that these operators often experienced higher levels of combat stress compared to regular infantry. The act of watching Japanese soldiers through a glowing green scope, sometimes for long stretches before pulling the trigger, took its toll. Veterans described how difficult it was to observe enemies performing ordinary tasks like eating, preparing weapons, or writing letters, knowing they were about to end their lives. On the other side, Japanese troops suffered a different kind of psychological wound. The loss of night once their greatest strength created a sense of helplessness that went beyond defeat in battle. Soldiers who had trained for years in night tactics now found those skills useless against Americans who could see through the dark. Military historians studying the Okinawa campaign have drawn lasting lessons from this. First, when a new technology is introduced, its psychological effects can outweigh its actual physical use. Only a limited number of infrared scopes were deployed, but Japanese soldiers everywhere feared them. Simply not knowing where the devices might be was enough to paralyze their operations. Second, when a fundamental assumption of warfare is overturned, entire tactical systems can collapse. Japanese doctrine was built on the idea that training and discipline would always give them an advantage in the dark. Once that belief failed, their entire defense system unraveled. Third, dominance in information. Being able to see the enemy without being seen can create greater advantages than firepower alone. Infrared scopes may not have killed the majority of Japanese soldiers, but their presence shaped the entire outcome of the Okinawa campaign. For decades after the war, the full story of Okinawa's infrared weapons remained hidden. Key reports, including the technical manual TM59341 on the Sniperscope system, after-action records from the 96th and 7th Infantry Divisions, and interrogation reports gathered for the Strategic Bombing Survey, were kept classified. These records, finally declassified in the 1990s, revealed both the revolutionary nature of the technology and the secrecy surrounding it. Even veterans were urged not to speak openly about their experiences. The U.S. military wanted to preserve the advantage for future wars. The one-sided nature of infrared combat also raised moral questions that remain in modern warfare. The use of infrared sniperscopes on Okinawa raised a serious question. Was it ethical to fight with technology that left the enemy almost defenseless? The American soldiers who operated these scopes asked themselves that question every night. After the war, military ethicists debated whether overwhelming advantages like this could still be called honorable warfare. Some argued that any innovation that saves the lives of your own troops is justified. Others believed that true combat requires some measure of shared risk, not one-sided execution. Japanese reflections after the war showed a different perspective. Military writings from their side generally accepted infrared technology as a natural step forward in warfare. For them, the shame did not lie in losing to superior tools, but in failing to anticipate and prepare for such advances. To Japanese officers, the scopes were simply another reminder of American material superiority. Frustrating, but not illegitimate. The impact of infrared sniperscopes on Okinawa went far beyond the battlefield. The experience convinced the U.S. military that staying ahead in technology, especially in sensors and surveillance, was essential. The idea of owning the night became a permanent part of American doctrine. Investment in night vision continued through the Cold War, with each generation of equipment widening the gap between forces that could see in the dark and those that could not. The advantage first demonstrated in 1945 became a defining mark of American power. For other nations, Okinawa delivered its own warning. Years of training, strong morale, or clever tactics could be erased overnight by a technological breakthrough. That lesson drove armies across the world to pursue their own night vision and sensor technologies. What began with just 150 infrared scopes sparked a global race in military innovation that has never stopped. Declassified manuals and technical records reveal the actual specifications of the T3 M3 Carbine fitted with an infrared scope. The complete system weighed about 28 to 30 lb. Its effective range was 70 yd in poor conditions and up to 125 yd in ideal conditions. Battery life ran 20 to 30 minutes under continuous use, or 3 to 4 hours with intermittent operation. The system used an RCA1P25 image intensifier tube, powered by a 6V lead-acid battery pack. Its infrared source was a sealed beam lamp fitted with a filter. Roughly 1,700 scopes were produced, and about 150 were sent to Okinawa. By today's standards, those figures look primitive, but in 1945 they were revolutionary. Being able to engage targets accurately at 70 or more yards in complete darkness was something no infantry soldier had ever done before. This technology gave the U.S. Army an ability that overturned decades of Japanese tactical doctrine. For over 40 years, Japanese infantry had perfected the art of night combat. Suddenly, that mastery counted for nothing. The arrival of 150 scoped carbines in the hands of specially trained Americans changed everything in the Battle of Okinawa. Although the scopes accounted directly for only a fraction of Japanese casualties, their true effect was far greater. They shattered the Japanese belief that night was their advantage. The psychological effect was enormous. Japanese troops stopped attempting night operations altogether, not only in areas covered by infrared but across the island. Supply routes broke down. Forward positions could not be reinforced and coordinated defenses collapsed. What had been a sophisticated system of night tactics turned into isolated positions left to fall one by one. Colonel Hirami Yahara, one of the few senior Japanese officers to survive the battle, later wrote in his memoir, "The Americans had conquered nature itself, turning our allied darkness into their weapon. We faced not just superior firepower but superior science. Against this, courage alone meant nothing. The American soldiers who carried these devices became the pioneers of a new kind of warfare, one where information mattered as much as firepower, and the ability to see first meant the ability to win." Their experiences, both their successes and the heavy psychological toll, set a pattern that still exists in modern combat. Okinawa proved a turning point. The infrared Sniperscope didn't just give U.S. forces an advantage, it destroyed a military doctrine that had been built since 1904. The Japanese infantry, who had relied on their night skills for 4 decades, were suddenly powerless against Americans who could see through the dark. The statistics only hint at the scope of the change. 150 devices were deployed. They were credited with causing 30% of Japanese night casualties in the first week. Japanese night operations dropped by 94% during the campaign. But the real victory was psychological. The total collapse of confidence in Japan's ability to fight at night. From April to June 1945, the night battles on Okinawa revealed a truth that is still relevant today. In modern warfare, the side that can see while staying hidden doesn't just gain an edge, they dominate the battlefield. Those heavy green-tinted scopes of 1945, weighing nearly 30 dalab and reaching only 70 YD, marked the start of a revolution. Japanese commanders never imagined that American carbines could pierce the dark at that range. That failure of imagination, combined with U.S. technological drive, played a part in ending the Pacific War. It also set the stage for decades of American military superiority. In the eerie glow of those early infrared sights, American soldiers were looking not just at enemy targets, but at the future of war. A future where technology could matter more than numbers, where information could matter more than firepower, and where the force that owned the night owned the victory. The lessons of Okinawa's night battles still echo today. The infrared Sniperscope was more than a weapon. It was the doorway to a new age of warfare, one where those unable to see in the dark had already lost.